The unexpected encounter. It was one of those quiet, dark nights when you'd expect little more than the occasional hum of tires on asphalt, the rustle of wind through leaves, and the gentle creak of trees moving under the weight of the breeze. I had just finished a shoot, one that had taken longer than expected due to some technical difficulties with my camera equipment. Now, as I drove along a quiet rural road on my way back home, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of peace. There were no streetlights here, only the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the pitch-black night. Everything seemed calm, undisturbed, like the world was holding its breath. But as my tires crunched against the narrow, cracked road, I saw something in the distance that made my heart race. A figure, moving, but slowly, like it didn't belong. I veered to the left, instinctively, as soon as my headlights illuminated whatever it was. The road was too narrow for comfort, but it felt like I had no choice. I was just trying to avoid whatever or whoever was standing there, oblivious to the approaching vehicle. The sharp, sickening sound of a loud thud echoed through the air, followed by the screech of metal against flesh and bone. My hands froze on the wheel. My breath stopped. I felt the car shudder and pull to the side as I braked hard. Everything inside me screamed to not look, to not face whatever nightmare had just unfolded in the middle of the night. But I couldn't just leave. I threw the car into park and rushed out, my mind barely grasping what was happening. As I hurried to the other side of the car, my heart beat so fast I could feel it in my ears. It was dark, the only light coming from the faint shine of my headlights, casting long shadows across the quiet road. There, lying in the street, was a young woman, a woman I hadn't seen coming, who seemed to materialize out of the blackness, perhaps from nowhere. Her body lay limply against the asphalt. I bent down, and my eyes immediately caught the blood dripping down her forehead from a gash. I froze. I couldn't tell whether she was breathing or not at first. Everything felt so still, like time itself had stopped, the events of the last few seconds echoing in my mind like a broken record. It was only when I heard a soft groan, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone crying, that I felt the first spark of movement in my chest. I leaned in closer, feeling the cold rush of night air against my skin. She was young, barely a woman, I thought. Her clothes were dirty, torn, but there was something about the way she laid there that made my heart ache. I pulled out my phone instinctively, ready to dial 911, but before I could press the first number, I heard her voice. "No, please," she whispered, her voice weak, trembling with fear and pain. I knelt down beside her. "What do you mean no? You're hurt, you need help. I'm calling an ambulance." "No, please, mister, don't call." "I'll be fine," she begged, her voice catching in her throat. I hesitated, the phone still in my hand, confusion washing over me. Why would she refuse help? Was she scared of the authorities? Or worse, was there something I was missing? I looked at her more closely. She seemed so young, fragile, her eyes filled with fear and desperation. Her hair was matted with dirt, and her clothes were tattered as if she had been through more than just a fall. I couldn't tell what was going on, but something told me this wasn't just a simple accident. "I don't know," I muttered. "I think you might have a concussion, and your foot doesn't look right. You need medical attention." I'm okay. Really, mister. I just need to rest. Please, don't call anyone," she insisted, her voice almost pleading now, her hand reaching out in a desperate gesture, as if to stop me. I looked down at her and frowned. I wasn't about to leave her here in the middle of the road, not with no one else around, and not with her clearly injured. But what could I do? She didn't want an ambulance, and she didn't look like she wanted anything else either. "All right," I said after a moment, my voice softening. "But I'm not just leaving you here. You need to come with me. I can help you. I don't know what's going on, but this isn't safe." I helped her sit up, my mind racing with possibilities. What if she was in trouble? What if she was hiding from something? As I helped her carefully stand, I noticed her foot was barely able to support her weight. She winced in pain but tried to stay composed. You don't have to walk on it. Just lean on me, I said. Let me help. With her arm draped over my shoulder, she limped along beside me as I guided her toward the passenger side of my car. There was no suitcase, no bag, no sign of where she had come from or what her story was. It struck me as odd, but I pushed the thought away. Once she was safely inside the car, I closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, my mind still on high alert. What was going on? Who was she? What had happened to her? I didn't ask those questions out loud. Not yet. Instead, I started the engine and began driving. Where are you headed? I asked gently, trying to break the silence that had settled between us. She hesitated, eyes glued to the road ahead. I was going to see my aunt and uncle, but I got lost. I don't know where I am. The uncertainty in her voice made me wonder whether she was telling the truth. Something didn't feel right. But again, I didn't press. At this point, I just wanted to get her somewhere safe. Where do they live? I asked. Maybe I can take you there. She shook her head. They don't know I'm coming. They're asleep. I couldn't understand the secrecy in her words, but there was something in the way she spoke that made me think she wasn't trying to deceive me. She seemed so desperate, like she was carrying a heavy burden, one that was far too much for her to bear. Look, it's nearly 2 a.m., I said, glancing over at her. Your aunt and uncle aren't expecting you. Let me take you somewhere safe tonight. You can rest, and tomorrow I'll drive you to wherever you need to go. She didn't say anything at first, just stared out the window, but I could tell she was weighing her options. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke again. Okay, she whispered. I drove for another few miles before pulling into a small convenience store parking lot. It was the only place still open at this hour. I'm going to grab some supplies to help with that ankle, I told her. Wait here. I'll be right back. When I returned to the car with a small medical kit, I noticed she had her eyes closed, and she didn't stir as I opened the door. I quietly slid into the seat next to her, and we resumed our drive. As I pulled into the parking lot of my condo building, I couldn't help but glance at her once more. She was still so quiet, distant, as though she was holding herself back from something, or perhaps from everything. I felt a pang of sympathy for her, but I knew this wasn't the time to ask questions. All right, we're here, I said softly. Let's get you inside. But as we made our way inside, I had no idea what lay ahead. No idea what would unfold over the next few hours, or how this strange encounter would change both of our lives in ways we couldn't yet understand. A stranger under my roof. The front door clicked behind us with a dull thud, marking the beginning of an unfamiliar chapter in what had been, until this moment, an otherwise uneventful night. As I guided her inside, I couldn't help but notice the contrast between the warm, soft glow of the apartment and the cold night air still hanging onto her. The wind had started to pick up outside, rattling the loose panes of the windows, but inside, the space was surprisingly quiet. My modest condo, with its bare walls and minimalist furniture, gave off an almost sterile feel. Yet, despite its simplicity, it was a sanctuary. A place of calm in a world that often felt like chaos. I turned on the lights as we entered the main living area. The light revealed more of her. She was younger than I had originally thought, her face framed by tangled, unkempt hair, her clothes stained and worn from whatever she had been through. Despite the dirt, the exhaustion in her eyes, there was something about her that was still striking. It wasn't a traditional beauty, but there was a resilience in her. Something in the way she carried herself, a quiet strength that was visible even in her frail state. Take a seat, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. I'll get you something to drink. You've been through a lot. She hesitated before lowering herself carefully onto the couch. It creaked under her weight, a reminder of how little I had here. Nothing extravagant or overly comfortable, just the bare essentials. The sofa was the only place to sit in the room, other than a couple of mismatched chairs that had once belonged to my grandmother. I walked toward the kitchen, my movements measured. The kitchen, though small, was the heart of the place. A few cabinets, a tiny stove, and a fridge that was currently half empty, save for a few frozen meals and some old takeout containers. She sat there, unmoving, her eyes following me as I opened the fridge and pulled out a bottle of water. I could feel her gaze on me, but it wasn't judgmental. It was more like curiosity mixed with fear, as if she was trying to assess me, trying to figure out my next move, and whether it would be the one that would end whatever tenuous thread of safety she was clinging to. I handed her the bottle of water, and she took it cautiously, as if afraid I would take it away. She unscrewed the cap with a shaking hand and took a small sip, her eyes never leaving mine. There was a long pause, neither of us knowing what to say. "Do you need anything else?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "I can get you something for your foot." She looked down at her ankle, which was still visibly swollen, her face twisted in discomfort. "I'm fine," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to worry about me." I was starting to feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me. Here was a young woman, clearly in pain, a stranger in my home, someone who needed help, but who seemed reluctant to accept it. There was something about her that didn't sit right with me, but at the same time, I couldn't just turn my back on her. She was hurt. She was alone. And I couldn't ignore that. "Listen, I'm not trying to pressure you," I said, sitting down across from her. "But you need to let me take care of that ankle. It's not something you should just walk off." She hesitated for a moment before finally nodding, as if accepting defeat. "Okay, but I'll be fine. It's just a sprain." I didn't believe her, not for a second. But I wasn't going to argue. Instead, I walked over to my medical kit, which I had grabbed on the way in, and pulled out the supplies I needed to tend to her injury. As I knelt down by her feet, I could feel the tension in the air. She was still stiff, as if she were holding herself back, still on edge. I couldn't blame her. If I had been in her position, I probably wouldn't have trusted anyone either. As I carefully removed her shoe and sock, I noticed the marks on her foot, the bruises, the swelling, the redness. It wasn't just a sprain. There was damage there, but I kept my thoughts to myself as I wrapped her ankle gently in an elastic bandage, trying not to cause her any more pain than necessary. She winced a few times, but didn't say a word, just watched me quietly, her eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite read. "There," I said, finishing up and sitting back on my heels. "That should help with the swelling. But you still need to rest." She looked at me, her eyes softening just a little. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little less tense than before. "I didn't expect this. I don't know why you're doing this." I felt the air shift slightly, as if she had just cracked open a door she had been holding tightly shut. The words came out before I could stop them, and before I fully understood why I was saying them. "I'm just trying to help," I said, meeting her gaze. "I don't expect anything in return. You need help, and I'm in a position to offer it. That's all." For a moment, she didn't respond, just stared at me with those same wide, uncertain eyes. But then, to my surprise, she let out a small sigh, almost like a release of some kind of pent-up tension. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't trust easily. I've been on my own for a long time." Her words hit me harder than I expected, as if a small but powerful weight had just been dropped on my chest. I had never known what it was like to live without safety, without a support system, without a home to return to at the end of the day. But the vulnerability in her voice, the pain I could hear even when she wasn't speaking, was something I couldn't ignore. "You don't have to apologize," I said, my voice gentle. "I understand. You don't owe me anything. Just get some rest, and when you're ready, I'll drive you wherever you need to go." She nodded, but didn't say anything else. Instead, she closed her eyes and leaned back into the couch, her body stiff and still, but there was a slight easing in her expression, as if she was finally allowing herself to relax, just a little. I didn't leave her side. I stayed in the same room, sitting across from her on the other end of the couch, just in case she needed something. The silence was thick, but not uncomfortable. Just two strangers in a quiet room, sharing a moment of unspoken understanding. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. The stillness between us felt enough. As I sat there, my mind wandered. Who was she really? What had brought her to this point in her life? I could only guess at the stories hidden behind her eyes. But I didn't press. It wasn't the time to ask. Maybe in the morning, she would open up, or maybe she wouldn't. It was her choice. All I could do was offer her a place to stay for the night, a safe space away from whatever had been chasing her. Eventually, she fell asleep, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been building for who knows how long. I watched her for a while, making sure she was comfortable, before quietly standing up and walking to the kitchen to make myself something to eat. As I prepared a late-night snack, I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter, this unexpected meeting, was going to change something in me. Something deep down that I hadn't even realized needed changing. Whatever had brought her here, whatever had led me to this moment, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to turn my back on her. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. In the stillness of the night, as the soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that filled the space, I realized that I had just crossed a threshold. And I wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. Secrets unveiled in the early morning light. The next morning arrived with a soft, golden light filtering through the blinds, casting delicate shadows across the apartment. I had always been more of a night owl, and mornings didn't come easily to me. But today, everything felt different. It was as if the world had slowed down overnight, and the air was just a little quieter, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. I woke up early, far earlier than I usually would, and made my way to the kitchen. The coffee machine was an old one, not the sleek, high-tech version you see in coffee shops, but it worked just fine for me. I poured the water in and pressed the button, waiting for the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee to fill the air. My mind was already buzzing with questions. Where was Megan going to go from here? What was her story? I had the unsettling feeling that there was more to her than she was letting on, but I also knew I wasn't going to get the answers if I pushed too hard. The soft hum of the coffee machine was the only noise in the apartment, and for a few moments, I let the quiet settle around me. It wasn't until I heard the faint sound of movement from the living room that I snapped out of my thoughts. Megan must have woken up. I grabbed a mug, filled it with the rich, steaming coffee, and walked into the living room. Megan was sitting on the couch, her feet propped up, the bandage on her ankle still visible. She had that same quiet, distant look on her face, as if she were lost in her own thoughts, miles away from the space she occupied. She hadn't noticed me at first, her gaze fixed on the window, staring out at the world beyond. "Good morning," I said gently, trying to ease her out of her thoughts. "How's your ankle feeling?" She turned her head slowly, meeting my gaze with those same cautious eyes. "Morning," she replied softly. "It's better. Still sore, but better." I handed her the cup of coffee, and she accepted it with a small, grateful smile. She took a sip, the warmth seeming to ground her, if only for a moment. "You don't have to stay here much longer if you don't want to," I said, settling down in the armchair across from her. "I'll drive you wherever you need to go." Her eyes flickered with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't exactly trust either. She set the coffee down on the small table in front of her and folded her hands in her lap, her fingers twitching as if she was trying to find something to hold on to. I don't have anywhere to go," she said finally, her voice barely audible. She seemed to shrink back into herself, as if the words themselves had taken up too much space. "I didn't really have anywhere to go last night either. That's why I was out there." My heart dropped in my chest, but I didn't say anything right away. I couldn't. I didn't know what to say. She continued, her voice quieter now. "I don't want to be a burden on you. I know I've already taken up your time. I'll leave soon, after I've rested a bit more." I sat there for a moment, thinking about what she just said. There was a heaviness in her words, a weight that went far beyond her physical injury. It felt like she was carrying a burden much larger than anything I could understand, and for the first time, I wondered how long she had been running, how long she had been without a place to call her own. "Look, Megan," I said after a long pause, "you don't have to go anywhere yet. You can stay as long as you need to. I'm not going to kick you out." She looked at me then, her gaze intense but searching, as if she was trying to figure out if I was telling the truth. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but she didn't. Instead, she looked away again, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "You don't know what it's like," she said softly, her voice cracking slightly as she spoke. "To be alone all the time, to have no one to rely on." I felt the sting of her words, and it hit me harder than I expected. The loneliness, the isolation, the feeling of not being wanted, of never having a place to go, it was something I had never fully understood until now. I had friends, family, a job I loved, a roof over my head. But for her, it was different. It had always been different. She was running from something, I realized. Running from a life that had broken her in ways I couldn't even imagine. Her eyes were clouded with a sorrow that I couldn't quite place, and yet it was obvious that the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. I didn't know what had brought her to this point, but I couldn't just turn away from her now. Something in me refused to. "Tell me what happened," I said, my voice soft, careful. "I can't help you if I don't know what's going on." Her eyes snapped to mine, and for a moment I thought she would pull away, close off, retreat. But instead, she let out a long, shaky breath and looked down at her hands. She was silent for a long time, and I didn't rush her. I didn't push. Finally, she spoke again. "I was living with someone," she began, her words slow, as if she were choosing them carefully. "I thought I was safe with him. I thought I had a place to stay, that everything was going to be okay. But it wasn't. I ended up leaving. I didn't have anywhere else to go. I couldn't go back, not after everything." I didn't say anything, not right away. Her voice had dropped, her words heavy with a quiet pain that I could almost feel. She wasn't looking at me anymore, her gaze far away again, as if the weight of her own history had pushed her into a space that felt safer in the silence. "I've been on my own since," she continued, her voice a little stronger now. "I've been surviving, trying to stay out of trouble. But sometimes it's hard. Sometimes the days blur together and I don't know where I'm going or how to get there. I don't know if I'm even supposed to keep going." It was then that I realized what was happening. She wasn't just talking about her ankle or the accident that had brought her to my door. She was talking about something much deeper, something much darker. This wasn't just a girl who had stumbled into my life by accident. She was a person who had been worn down by circumstances far beyond her control. And now here she was, broken but still fighting. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," I said, my voice low and steady. "I don't know what your situation is or what you've been through, but you don't have to keep running. You can stay here for as long as you need to." She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine for sincerity, for something she could believe in. It wasn't a quick look, but one filled with suspicion, hope, and an unfamiliar kind of longing. "I'm not sure I can trust anyone anymore," she whispered, the words hanging in the air like an invisible weight. "I get that," I said gently. "But trust doesn't have to come all at once. Just take it one step at a time." Her eyes softened, and for a moment I thought I saw something there, something like relief, but fleeting. She nodded slowly, but didn't say anything more. She didn't have to. The silence between us now wasn't awkward. It was a shared understanding, a quiet space where words were no longer necessary. We sat there, two strangers who had found their lives unexpectedly intertwined, and as the morning light continued to filter through the blinds, I realized that Megan wasn't just someone I was helping for the night. She had become a part of my life, whether I wanted to admit it or not. And maybe, just maybe, I had become a part of hers as well. But no matter how things turned out, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to turn my back on her now. Not after everything. The unspoken truths between us. The days that followed felt like a blur. What was supposed to be a temporary act of kindness, a brief shelter from the storm, had slowly evolved into something more profound. It wasn't just a question of helping a stranger with an injury anymore. It was becoming about offering something far more elusive. Understanding. A safe space. A place where neither of us had to wear the mask we put on for the rest of the world. As the days drifted by, I tried to give Megan space, but I also knew she was struggling with something much deeper than a sprained ankle or a fractured sense of trust. She had built walls around herself, walls that I couldn't see, walls that she wasn't going to tear down just because I offered her a cup of coffee and a place to sleep. And yet, she stayed. I never pried into her past. I never pushed her to reveal more than she was willing to share, even though I could feel that there was a flood of emotions inside her just waiting to break free. The more I saw of her, the more I realized that the girl sitting in front of me, the girl who had been so cautious at first, was just as lost as I was, perhaps more so. We were both trying to figure out where we fit in the world, and neither of us had the answers. I had my routines, my photography projects, my late-night drives to get inspiration, my quiet evenings spent editing photos and drinking too much coffee. But Megan's days were all about surviving. She had no routine. She had no certainty about the future. There was no job waiting for her, no safety net to catch her when she stumbled. I knew that her past, whatever it was, had left scars that went far deeper than her ankle injury. One morning, I found her sitting on the couch, staring at the floor, as though something in the room had captured her attention. Something invisible, something heavy in the air. Her eyes were distant, her face etched with exhaustion, and I couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. There were moments like this, when I could sense the weight of her silence, a silence that wasn't just about being alone. It was the kind of silence that told me she was processing, dealing with emotions that she had long buried. I stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame for a moment, watching her. It felt intrusive to approach her directly, so I waited, letting her speak when she was ready. I had learned not to rush her. "John," she said, her voice soft but clear. She had started to use my name more frequently now, and that small shift told me something important. She was beginning to trust me, if only a little. "Yeah," I replied, not moving, just watching her, trying to gauge her mood. "I've been thinking," she began, her fingers tracing the edge of the coffee table absently, "about everything. About how I ended up here." I nodded, keeping my tone neutral. "What have you been thinking?" She took a deep breath before answering, her gaze still fixed on the table, as if the words were coming from somewhere deep within her, pulling themselves out slowly, like reluctant memories resurfacing. "I never planned to end up like this," she continued, her voice faltering. "I had a life. A real life. I thought everything was going fine. But then, everything changed. One night, one mistake, and everything fell apart." She paused for a long moment, and I could see the sadness in her eyes. It was raw and genuine. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could get away from it all. But things don't always work out the way you plan. I moved closer, silently sitting down beside her. "You don't have to explain everything to me if you don't want to. I'm not going to push you." She glanced at me, her eyes tired. But there was something new there. A spark. A flicker of something she hadn't shown before. I didn't know where else to go. "I don't have anyone. I thought I could keep running. But it gets harder. And now I'm here. With you. A stranger." Her voice dropped, barely above a whisper, and I'm not sure how to deal with it. The vulnerability in her words caught me off guard. I had been so focused on trying to help, trying to give her a safe space, that I had never stopped to consider just how difficult it must have been for her to accept that help, to allow herself to be vulnerable. It's okay to let your guard down, you know, I said, my voice softer now, more genuine. You don't have to carry everything alone, Megan. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, as if she was on the edge of something, on the edge of telling me the truth, or perhaps on the edge of shutting me out entirely. But before she could say anything more, I spoke again. I don't know what you've been through, I said, choosing my words carefully. But I do know that you don't have to keep running. You can stay here as long as you need to. I won't make you feel like a burden. And I won't judge you. For a long moment, she didn't respond. I could feel the weight of her decision hanging in the air, whether she was going to take me at my word, or whether she was going to retreat again. The tension was palpable. Finally, she let out a soft sigh. I know I'm not the easiest person to live with, she said quietly, her voice tinged with self-deprecation. I get that, but sometimes I wish I could just wake up and everything would be different. I placed my hand on the armrest, close enough to her to show that I was there, but not too close to invade her space. Sometimes we don't get to choose how things turn out, but what we can choose is how we move forward. I don't have all the answers, and I'm not saying everything's going to be easy, but you don't have to do this by yourself. I'm not going anywhere. For the first time since I had met her, I saw a small, genuine smile tug at the corners of her lips. It was faint, but it was there. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I don't know how to explain it, but I appreciate what you're doing for me. Hey, no problem, I said, trying to make light of the situation. It's not like I have a bunch of other people lining up for my couch. It's the least I can do. She laughed softly, the sound a welcome change to the heavy atmosphere that had settled around us. There was still a long way to go, still much we didn't know about each other, but in that moment, there was something unspoken between us, a silent agreement that we weren't going to let go of the fragile thread that had begun to tie us together. I wanted to say more, but I didn't. I didn't need to. The silence that followed was comfortable, easy. We didn't need to rush. We had time. Over the next few days, Megan seemed to settle in a bit more. She started taking up space in the apartment, leaving her shoes by the door, sitting at the kitchen table while I cooked, talking to me about trivial things that didn't matter much, but still felt like progress. She wasn't fully comfortable yet. I could tell, but she was starting to trust me in small ways. And for her, that was monumental. As for me, I found myself thinking about her more than I should. I tried to keep my distance emotionally, knowing that this wasn't just some fleeting encounter. This wasn't a simple case of helping someone out. Something in me had shifted the moment I had offered her that first glass of water. I knew it was still too early to know what, if anything, would come from this. But in the quiet mornings and the still nights when everything was calm, I realized something important. We were both looking for a place to belong. And maybe, just maybe, this place was where we could both find it, together.